a lot of media, prosthetics are often portrayed as a perfect replacement for lost limbs. So much so that it's pretty much the norm for a prosthetic limb to have very little impact on its user, or it's portrayed as an improvement to their previous run-of-the-mill meat limb. This trope shows up everywhere, so let's talk about it. Hey, I'm Cyborg, I'm a double leg amputee here to help you create better disability rep in your stories. And today, we're going to be looking at the perfect prosthetic trope. Before we get into things, I wanted to talk about some changes I'm making to the channel real quick. A big part of the reason why I just kind of disappeared after my first few videos was because I haven't been very well for the last year or so, and so recording normal video footage in front of a camera was getting really hard to do consistently. So instead, I'm going to try switching to a PNG tuber with some of my art time lapses in the background. I'm hoping that'll make the recording process a little bit easier so I can actually make videos again without an entire year going between them, but we'll see how that goes. If you're just interested in seeing the art stuff though, without the disability and writing advice, I've made a second channel just for the time lapses on their own, and I'm going to be using that second channel to also talk about things like my webcomics and my own personal projects in the future. I had initially hoped that by the time this video went live, I'd have a few videos up on the other channel already, but while I was compiling the footage for the background of this video, I realized that all of the original time-lapse footage I recorded in the last 6 or more months has corrupted because apparently I was saving it wrong this entire time, and now all of it is basically useless. Oh, the joys of technology. So as of recording this video, I honestly don't know what will be up on the channel by the time people see this, but if there's still not a whole lot there, more is coming, I promise. For today's video though, since the original background footage was included in those lost files, I'm going to be designing Avery, the main character in a comic I've been thinking of making. It's still in the very early concept stages, but it's literally all I have right now, so I'm working with what I've got. As you can see, Avery is a leg amputee as well as a wheelchair basketball player. As well as using this as a way to figure out a potential design for Avery, I'm also using this as a bit of a style test for the comic as a whole to see how well I can blend 2D and 3D elements. And honestly, I think I pulled it off fairly well for such an early concept. If you want to know more about Avery and her story, keep an eye out on the other channel, I'll be talking about it over there pretty shortly. Also, I do just want to say before we get into things, that just because I use a piece of media as an example in this video, does not mean that I necessarily think that the example is bad representation per se. In fact, some of my go-to examples for amazing disability rep do use this trope. For me personally, while I do find this trope very frustrating, it doesn't necessarily ruin a piece of media for me unless it's handled especially poorly. However, other disabled people might feel differently. I'm just one person with a limb difference. We aren't a monolith, we're all gonna have different opinions on stuff like this. However, it is something that I think non-disabled authors and creatives need to be more aware of, which is why we're gonna talk about it. I'd also just like to remind people that I'm a double leg amputee. Leg prosthetics are what I've got the most experience with, and so that's where the majority of my focus is gonna be in this video. But a lot of this stuff also applies to arm prosthetics, even if I don't specifically mention them. In fact, I'd probably make the argument that this trope is more common and more often handled way worse with arm prosthetics specifically. However, I just don't have the lived experience to be able to explain why these depictions specifically fall flat in the same way that I can with leg prosthetics. As always, videos like this are meant to be a jumping off point, they're not meant to be your one-stop shop for all your research needs. Alright, I think I've waffled on long enough, let's get into the actual video. So what actually is the perfect prosthetic trope? In the most blatant examples of this trope, the prosthetic is treated more like a cure for a limb difference than a mobility aid. It functions exactly like the limb the character lost, or just never had, to the point where it's used as a purely aesthetic change. But this trope can show up in more subtle ways as well. Sometimes it looks like a prosthetic user's lack of limbs is never mentioned once a fully functional prosthetic is in the picture. Or like a character taking to their prosthetic with virtually no adjustment needed, and their disability rarely, if ever, being mentioned after that. Sometimes it looks like the only time a character's amputation is actually treated like a disability is when the prosthetic isn't working or isn't functioning at full capacity. But the rest of the time you can't even tell that they're disabled. That last point is a very popular way to end stories, where a character's happily ever after is tied up in them getting a good prosthetic, and it's implied that the problems that they still have, if any, are all pretty minor or surface level. The specifics will change depending on the genre, of course, and there's a lot of variations of this trope. But why? Why is this trope so common? Well, I have a few theories. I would guess a big part of it comes from a misunderstanding of disability in general, but specifically what prosthetics actually are and what they're meant to do, which we'll talk more about soon. However, I think overcorrection from other older tropes also plays a role as well. You see, for a long time, amputees and folks with limb differences, as well as a lot of other visibly disabled people, were predominantly shown in media as being sad, depressed, and unable to do pretty much anything. Very much falling into another trope called the sad disabled person, or as I like to call it, the woe is me trope. As a kid, this was really the only way I ever saw people like me on screen or in books. And honestly, this was the case for a lot of people with limb differences and amputations prior to 2010. And so the limb difference community started to push back against this kind of portrayal, and they were actually pretty successful in changing the narrative in the public's eye. Possibly a little bit too successful. The optimist in me thinks that a lot of creators genuinely were trying to do right by our community, but many simply overcorrected. We wanted people to tell stories where we were active participants in the plot and in the action, and where our whole personalities didn't revolve around us being sad about our disabilities. And I think a lot of creators didn't necessarily know how to do that without erasing the effects of our disability entirely. In this case, while the intentions were good, the execution was misguided at best. The pessimist in me, though, thinks that this trope comes up so often because writing prosthetic users this way is just easier. You get to have a disabled character, claim you have disability representation, all without having to do much extra work or research because the majority of your audience won't notice if you aren't accurate. In fact, because of how prevalent this trope is, they actually kind of expect it. You also, for the most part, will usually be able to dodge the backlash that other kinds of disability representation usually get. If you want a good example of what I'm talking about, take a look at how fans of TTRPG games like D&D and Pathfinder reacted to the concept of a combat wheelchair being available to player characters compared to how they reacted to prosthetics being available to player characters. Spoiler alert for anyone who was fortunate enough to miss the train wreck that was the combat wheelchair controversy. It was a very different reaction. Like I mentioned before though, I also think the public's general lack of understanding about disability, and specifically amputees and people with limb differences, plays a role as well. There are a lot of people who, in my experience, wholeheartedly believe that the more visible a disability is, the worse it is. Limb differences and amputations, by their very nature, are very, very visible, but prosthetics make them somewhat less so. Even prosthetics that aren't actively trying to be discreet still make the actually disabling parts of being an amputee or someone with a limb difference a little less noticeable to an outside observer. But looks can be deceiving. Using a prosthetic is very, very different to a biological limb, and you won't necessarily see how in a casual interaction with, say, a coworker or neighbor, but if you're writing or creating a character, these are things that you need to be aware of. Especially because there is a very real and heavy stigma applied to people with limb differences to keep those things hidden from the public and to not make their disabilities other people's problems. There are a lot of other contributing factors as well, such as the fact that a lot of creatives don't even consider the connection to real prosthetics when creating characters with, say, robotic limbs in genres like sci-fi. So they may have never even considered that these tropes could be impacting people's attitudes towards a real group of people. And you can't research something if it's never even crossed your mind. Amputees in particular are also very frequently used in inspiration porn content, which uses the angle that disabilities are something that can be overcome with a good attitude, often downplaying the way those disabilities actually impact us, usually at the expense of either the person in the content itself, or the disability community as a whole. The prosthetic component manufacturing industry is also guilty of contributing to this misconception, at least in my opinion, since it often advertises its products as being just as good as the real thing, or the only way back to a normal life. You might think you've never seen an advertisement for a prosthetic limb, but they are advertised to the public, just not in the normal ways. Usually, it's through flashy news stories talking about breakthroughs in prosthetic technology that will be life-changing for millions of disabled people around the world, and the folks who don't need them often just take it at face value in my experience. Though I do think it's important to specify that when I talk about the prosthetic component manufacturing industry, I am just talking about the people creating the components, not prosthetists. In my experience, prosthetists are pretty vocal about the drawbacks of a prosthetic. Finally, I also think that the recent increase in popularity of concepts like transhumanism contributes to the trope as well. These movements often talk about robotic or bionic body parts being enhancements and the way of the future, and I think people get a little bit too caught up on what may potentially be possible in the future with the real current experiences of people with robotic limbs, aka prosthetics. There are also inherently disabling things that come with removing and replacing parts of your body. Things that won't go away with some fancier tech that I rarely ever see acknowledged in these kinds of spaces. This isn't to say that I think transhumanism as a concept is inherently bad or harmful or anything like that. It's a very complicated topic, but I do think that a lot of transhumanist spaces would be greatly benefited by listening to the voices of disabled people. People with limb differences who use prosthetics in particular, but also just disabled voices in general. So with all these things considered, from trying to avoid older tropes to just a general misunderstanding of how prosthetics work and what's actually possible, not to mention social stigma, it's little wonder that this trope is as common as it is. So how do we actually avoid the perfect prosthetic trope? The most important thing to remember is that no matter how good the prosthetic is, limb loss and limb difference are still disabilities, and they will always have some inherently disabling aspects to them. And it's not a bad thing to acknowledge that. You just want to make sure you're not going too far in the other direction and playing into the sad disabled person trope at the other end of the spectrum. It's all about striking a balance. So let's go over some of the ways that you can show your character's disability still impacting them even with a prosthetic. You don't have to use all these recommendations, of course, just choose the ones that would best fit your tone, your character, their circumstances, and your setting. As I've said at least a dozen times in this video already, prosthetics are just different to biological limbs. But what does that actually mean? It means that a prosthetic is not just a fleshy limb with a different coat of paint. They may do the same basic thing as their meat limb counterparts, but how they go about doing it is so drastically different that it fundamentally changes how they're used. Both a biological leg and a prosthetic leg help their user to walk, but the way the prosthetic goes about achieving this is very, very different. Now, I could break down each and every individual component that goes into a prosthetic leg and explain how that's different from a biological leg, but if I did that, we'd be here all day, and honestly, it would probably not be that entertaining, so instead let's specifically look at prosthetic feet as an example of what I'm talking about. There are dozens of joints in a biological foot, but most prosthetic feet have no joints or moving parts at all. Instead of having dozens of articulated, moving parts to mimic the real bone and muscle structure of a foot, which would require power to function, be more prone to failure, and make the prosthetic much, much heavier for very little gain, prosthetic feet are often constructed from flexible carbon fiber sheets inside a rubber foot-shaped shell. This allows a similar amount of bend and flex that those joints would usually provide, without all the drawbacks that come from trying to directly mimic it with technology. And making those sheets into different shapes makes them more ideal for different activities. For example, feet made for general use like walking around the city are simple and light, shaped to encourage the most energy-efficient steps, while allowing their users to do things like wear normal shoes. Feet made for rough terrain often have a split down the middle of the foot, which allows the carbon fiber sheets to bend better over rocks when there's no ankle joint. And some newer designs also include a kind of suspension using pressurized air pulled from the prosthetic socket to allow some additional padding. Running blades, probably the most distinct looking type of prosthetic foot, are made out of the same carbon fiber sheets, but crafted into a bigger arch to absorb more of the pressure when the foot hits the ground, and then redirect that force to propel their user forward, kind of like a giant spring, often at the expense of their balance. This is why, if you watched the Paralympics recently, you might have noticed that as soon as the double leg amputees finish their race, a lot of them fall over. And it's because those prosthetics are not very easy to stand on when you're not running at full tilt. Because of this, a lot of amputees end up having multiple prosthetic feet that they can swap in and out as they need. I currently have 4 sets of prosthetic feet that I've accumulated over the years, and I've kept them because they're all good for different things. This first one is from my stubby legs, also called foreshortened prosthetics, which are a type of starter legs specifically for people with double leg amputations, designed to get their users used to wearing prosthetics. The feet on them are simple and basic, with a rigid foot that prioritizes building strength and balance, and removing pretty much any moving parts to simplify that. Most people move away from stubbies after a while, but despite, or I guess maybe because of their simplicity, I personally prefer them, as they're just what feel the most natural for me to use. Next is the foot I used when I lived in the city, and I was walking around a decent amount, but not for very long periods at a time, and it was all mostly on pretty even ground. This is one of those simple feet that I mentioned before. It's designed to prioritize endurance in someone who's not quite active enough for a proper active foot, and still helps with balance since I was a little bit unsure on my feet at this point. I don't really use this one very often anymore, but I keep it around just in case. It is supposed to have a rubber foot shell on it so that I can wear shoes, but I appear to have lost it at some point, so this tends to be the foot that I use when I can't be bothered fiddling around with shoes. This next one was my first active foot, designed for someone who can walk around a lot and is walking on terrain that's not always smooth. Like the other one, it prioritizes endurance, but it handles rougher terrain a little bit better than the city foot did because of the split down the middle. These are pretty good all-rounder feet, but I typically only use them when I'm doing things like going to the beach, where I need the added flexibility that I can't get from the city foot, but don't want to risk damaging the more complicated parts on my more modern active foot. And finally, this is my current active foot. Like the others were supposed to have, it has a rubber foot cover on it so I can wear shoes, but inside of that, it mostly just looks like the previous active foot. The main difference is that it has one of those chambers I mentioned earlier that pulls air from the socket to act as suspension. This means that it's even better at handling rougher and more uneven terrains, but has extra parts that are a bit more prone to wear and tear, making it not ideal for environments like the beach. The suspension also makes it a little bit easier on my joints if I was to do some light running, but it's nowhere near as efficient as an actual running leg would be. Despite what I said earlier, there have actually been a few robotic feet that were available to the public that were designed as a kind of all-purpose option, using electronic ankles and joints which more closely mimics a biological foot, but they never really catch on. The mechanism just adds too much extra weight, and needing to charge your foot's batteries is pretty inconvenient, given that it doesn't really do anything that the simpler carbon fiber feet can't already do. Electronic knees like the C leg are more popular. I even have one myself, but this is because the pros these knees offer, such as the variability in movement, actually do outweigh those previously mentioned cons. Even then though, a lot of amputees with knee prosthetics will also have a non-electronic knee because, well, there are just some things that the mechanical or even lock knees do better. The differences between prosthetic limbs and biological limbs, though, are even clearer with prosthetic hands. While I can't go into specifics since I don't have the lived experience of using them, I have noticed the same general rule applies. Robotic hands that closely mimic meat hands do exist and are actually reasonably popular, but a lot of arm amputees I know still prefer simpler, more specialized devices that are especially well suited to do specific tasks, and just swap between them as needed. A big part of this is because the all-purpose hands, while they can do a lot, can't do everything, and they can be pretty clunky. They usually require manual adjustment from the person's other hand to swap between tasks that require different types of grips. And the open and close movement of the hand is controlled by an entirely different set of muscles or mechanisms than it would be in a meat hand. A prosthetic hand still grabs and holds things, but it doesn't do it in the same way that a biological hand would. The way it's used is different, and if you watch real arm amputees using their prosthetics, you can see that pretty easily. Of course, all of this is focusing on modern prosthetics. Older prosthetics were obviously even less efficient and harder to use, so those differences will be even more noticeable, which is something to keep in mind if you're writing something set in the past. Meanwhile, some of these points would probably get smoothed out in a futuristic sci-fi setting with more advanced tech, or if magic is present in a fantasy. But I'd encourage creators to consider using these things I talked about as a jumping off point anyway, even in a less grounded setting. Some people will just always prefer a simpler approach, like how I prefer my stubbies over my more advanced active legs. And sometimes trying to directly mimic nature just doesn't produce the most efficient or useful result. Give your prosthetic some kind of innate drawback, that being something that it can't do even when it's functioning perfectly as the maker intended, and let your character figure out their own way around it. That might look like your character occasionally swapping their prosthetic out for something that's a little bit more specialized or a little less conventional. Or it might look like them creatively avoiding the issue altogether. Get creative, have fun with it, and think outside the box instead of creating yet another character with just normal arm, but silver. Another thing to consider is how missing a limb affects your proprioception, which is something that a prosthetic won't really be able to fix. Proprioception is how you know where your body parts are in space without necessarily needing to look at them. It's how most people know where their foot is going to land while they're walking, or how you're able to do things like lift up a glass of water or a pencil without actually needing to watch your hand do it. Your brain does this by creating a mental map of your body, but the problem is that this map doesn't get adjusted if you lose a limb. And if that map doesn't accurately reflect your real body, you're not going to have an accurate sense of proprioception anymore. This might look like a leg amputee being a little bit less stable on their feet, or an arm amputee needing to watch their hand closely when they grab something with it. Those born without their limbs who take to using prosthetics often have a lot of trouble with proprioception, as their brains aren't used to having that limb in the first place, whereas an amputee's brain can often be tricked into using that outdated body map to help them adjust, though it's impossible to line it up perfectly. Prosthetics that directly integrate into the nervous system, while rare, do exist, and even this direct connection doesn't completely erase the issue of proprioception for reasons doctors actually aren't quite sure about. This is something that does become less of a problem with time, of course. Eventually, someone proficient with their prosthetics will learn to compensate, but their sense of proprioception will never be 100% perfect. At the end of the day, no matter how it attaches, a prosthetic is still not a natural part of the body, and that will always cause some issues. It also means that if you're not constantly practicing with your prosthetics all the time, you may have to relearn those compensation skills if you've taken a bit of a break. Unfortunately, it's not like riding a bike. You can and do forget how to use prosthetics over time. You also have to remember that a prosthetic is not a natural part of the body. No matter how fancy it is, your brain will likely always interpret the weight of a prosthetic as something that's attached to you, not part of you. And that's an important distinction to make, because it means that even though the prosthetics are actually a lot lighter than a biological limb, they feel so much heavier. This is because while a meat limb is actually heavier, a lot of that weight is from the muscles that are actively contributing to the limb working, so it doesn't really feel like it's that heavy. Your brain also kind of filters that extra weight out, but it can't do that with a prosthetic. There's also the fact that when you have less of your original meat limb, you have even less muscle to work with to move the big thing that's now strapped to it, so it feels a lot heavier than it actually is. The more of the limb that you've lost or just didn't have, the less muscle you have left to move it, and the heavier the prosthetic is going to feel. It's for this reason that a lot of amputees and people with limb differences tend to get tired when using their prosthetics a lot quicker than an able-bodied person would. Some of us are fit enough where you almost wouldn't notice the extra effort we have to put in, but it takes a lot of work to get to that point. And once again, just because it's not visible from the outside doesn't mean it's not a factor. Water can also present a bit of a problem when you use a prosthetic. Most prosthetics aren't waterproof, and so prosthetic users have to be very careful about when and how they come into contact with it. For those of us with electric components, contact with water at all will likely damage the device. This can even include especially heavy rain. A few drops here and there won't hurt it, but getting caught in torrential rain is not going to do it any favors. But even those of us who don't have electronic components on our prosthetics still have to worry about water for different reasons. If the prosthetic has parts that are made out of metal, which most prosthetics do, water can cause them to rust, especially if it's salty. Other prosthetics have foam covers, which give the illusion of a limb with the general shape of muscle and fat. But these covers usually don't come off, and if they get wet enough that water seeps all the way through, it's really hard to dry them, and they usually end up becoming moldy. Something I learnt the hard way. Finally, a lot of modern prosthetics also float. Many are made of very lightweight materials, and many prosthetic designs have pockets of air trapped inside them. For leg prosthetics in particular, this means that a user might, at best, struggle to swim with them on, but at worst may actually get flipped upside down and become trapped underwater. Again, something that I have experienced firsthand. On the flip side, older prosthetics were usually made of very heavy materials like wood or steel, and so they had the opposite problem, acting like a weight and pulling the person down if they were to wear them in the water. Water-safe prosthetics do exist. I actually had a pair of them when I was a teenager. The ones I had were hollow and designed specifically for me to be able to swim with fins on when I was in the ocean. However, most amputees typically just prefer to swim without any prosthetics at all. Some people with prosthetics also experience pressure sores and pain specifically from their prosthetics. Modern prosthetics typically attach to the body using a socket made of carbon fiber or fiberglass, and are held on either by pressure using a vacuum seal or through a mechanical lock locking system built into the socket, or some combination of the two. No matter the specifics though, the socket has to be very, very tight in order to stay on, and this means that extended periods of use can lead to rub spots, blisters, and pressure sores. Many socket prosthetics also use silicone liners to add some extra padding, but this does mean that wounds caused by pressure can't breathe, and bacteria in the sweat has nowhere to go, meaning that if a prosthetic user doesn't rest when one of these wounds occurs, it can quickly and easily turn into a very serious infection, which in extreme cases can even mean losing more of your limb. Now, in a properly fitting prosthetic used by someone who is fully adjusted to them, this doesn't happen very often, but it is something that most prosthetic users have to be mindful of. Some new prosthetics do use a different method of attachment called osseointegration, where prosthetics attach to a clip, surgically implanted into the person's bone. While osseointegration avoids many of the issues like pressure sores that come from a socket, they have their own issues. Mainly that they are incredibly expensive, and as of right now have a pretty high failure rate due to the implant getting infected. Because the implants are directly connected to the bone, these infections become very serious very quickly. Many people with osseointegration limbs have to be on very strong medication to keep these infections at bay, and they're generally considered unsuitable for anyone who's going to be regularly coming into contact with unclean environments. And finally, prosthetics also require regular maintenance from a specialist called a prosthetist, who we mentioned earlier, and they don't last forever. Some parts, like a prosthetic foot or a hand, can be reused a few times, but the sockets of a prosthetic need to be completely remade anytime your body changes shape, even just a little bit, including things like if you lose or gain weight, you start experiencing more swelling than you did when the prosthetic was made, or you're just a child who's growing. Children in particular need a new prosthetic every couple of months, because they grow so fast, and as such, their prosthetics have to be made with that growth in mind. If they go too long without an adjustment or an entirely new prosthetic, it can seriously impact the child and their growth, something that I've only ever seen represented in media once in Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. However, even small adjustments can be costly depending on where you live. While prosthetics are built to be sturdy and reliable, they do need a lot of work to stay that way. The more complex the prosthetic, the more work is needed. Complicated electronic components may need to have regular maintenance done by your prosthetist, or even by the specific component's manufacturer, and depending on where you live, that might mean having to send your prosthetic limb away for it to be done. While my prosthetist technically does have the skills and knowledge to do the maintenance needed on my electronic knee, for example, the manufacturer forbids anyone not from their company to provide that service, meaning my leg needs to be shipped off to Germany once every few years if I want to keep the warranty. This has the unfortunate side effect of sometimes your limbs get lost in the post. Shout out to Australia Post, who lost mine twice, meaning it can be months before you get it back or get a replacement. Okay, so we've talked about some of the things that lean more on the negative side that you can include to get your character's prosthetic away from being a perfect prosthetic. But not every difference is inherently negative or even really that big of a deal, but that doesn't make their inclusion any less important. In fact, to me personally, it's these little moments in the depiction of a disability that go the furthest to making it feel more genuine. My amputation does affect me from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to bed, but that doesn't mean that every single way it impacts me is always inherently bad or negative. For example, back when I was working a normal job and going to university, I would often come home, throw my legs off at the door with the shoes still attached, and get into my wheelchair. The same way you might throw your shoes off after work and replace them with some comfy socks or a pair of cozy slippers. This is something I've only ever seen depicted on screen once, with Ida from the Owl House, and she wasn't even an amputee yet. After that, my day mostly looked the same as other people working a 9 to 5. I'd make myself dinner, watch some TV or play some games, maybe do some extra work at my desk or chat with friends. The fact that my afternoon and evening routine was done from a wheelchair wasn't a bad thing, it was just different. Likewise, I also don't sleep or shower with my prosthetics on, for the same reason most other people probably wouldn't take a shower or sleep with thigh-high steel-cap boots on. In your own stories, this might look like giving your characters similar alterations to how they go about their day. Let them take their arm or leg off when they're resting or relaxing. Show them taking a few minutes longer to get ready because they have to put it back on. Show them doing things without it. it. Arm amputees in particular tend to get very good at going about their days without a prosthetic at all. And leg amputees will often either learn to get around more relaxed spaces like their homes using a different mobility aid like wheelchairs or occasionally crutches, or if they're capable of doing it, just hopping around. Even when everything is going well and working as intended, your limb-different characters won't want to wear their prosthetics 24/7, no matter how much they love them. There doesn't have to be something wrong or painful about it to not want it glued to you at all times. Just like how you can absolutely love a pair of boots, but that doesn't mean that you want to sleep in them. For more action-focused stories, having a prosthetic will also do things like change how you fight. There's the obvious things, like the limb being detachable as a way to get out of a bad situation, but it'll also do things like changing the fighting techniques you use. A lot of prosthetics are very solid, and I've known people who have had to use their prosthetics as a weapon in a self-defense situation. Some prosthetic users might also divert attackers towards a concealed prosthetic made to look like a normal limb, since the prosthetic can be replaced easier than your actual body parts can, and it will be a lot less painful to get hit there. It might even hurt your attacker if you're lucky. On the flip side, some prosthetic users might come up with different ways to account for something that their prosthetic can't do well or reliably, such as focusing on using strong, unmoving stances because their prosthetic legs might not allow for as much agility. As is the case with all things when it comes to disability though, there's no one correct way to handle this. I can't come on here and say every single person with a leg prosthetic will fight like this and every single person with an arm prosthetic will fight like that. Different characters are going to handle situations like this differently, and what works well for one person with one type of prosthetic might not work well for another person with that same prosthetic. But if your prosthetic using character is going to be in combat, then their prosthetic should have some kind of influence on how they fight, even if it's just something small. Otherwise, you end up with scenes like this in Captain America Civil War. Bucky, your arm is detachable. Why did this trap you? Whether we're talking about negative things or just neutral differences that come from using a prosthetic, you don't want to go too far with any one of these examples. The key is to strike a balance. Of course, the old writing advice, show don't tell, also applies here. It's one thing to tell us all of this, but unless we actually see it play out in your story, it doesn't mean anything. Before we move on, I just wanted to talk about some red flags that I've noticed might indicate that this trope is showing up in your work. The perfect prosthetic is one of those tropes that's so prevalent I honestly don't blame people for missing it most of the time. But for one reason or another, typically when it does show up, it's also accompanied by a few other, I guess, mini tropes for lack of a better word. And they can act as a bit of a warning that you might need to take another look through your work. It's not a guarantee, mind you. Just because these things are present doesn't mean the perfect prosthetic trope is, but it is a reoccurring pattern that I've noticed. So the first one is, I forgot your character was even disabled. If you send your manuscripts away for developmental edits and beta reading, or if other people on your development team are leaving comments that are something to the effect of, I forgot your character was an amputee, or even worse if you're saying this yourself, then there's a good chance you've written a perfect prosthetic. I've even seen people use this as a flex in the marketing for their book, saying that their amputee character is such a badass they forgot they were even disabled. To put into context why this is bad and why this is a red flag for the perfect prosthetic trope, let me demonstrate by swapping that out with another part of my identity. If you heard someone say, the queer representation in this story is so good you can't even tell the main character is queer, I hope you can see why that's not a good thing. And it probably means that you haven't given that part of their identity enough attention. The same goes for disability. Forgetting that a character is disabled is not the goal. Calling them everything but prosthetics. This one is a bit more of a yellow flag than a red flag, but I've noticed a lot of stories that have perfect prosthetics almost seem to go out of their way to avoid calling them prosthetics, or even avoid saying words like amputee, limb difference, or disabled entirely. Sometimes they'll call them robotic limbs, bionics, cybernetics, implants, peg legs, hook hands, mechanical or mech limbs, pretty much anything but prosthetic. Likewise, characters in these settings will often avoid using the term disabled, amputee, or limb difference to describe someone, or even themselves, instead opting to just either never mention it or go with something that's a bit more fun sounding, like cyborg. And don't worry, I'm aware of the irony there. I say that this is a yellow flag because there's a lot of nuance here. Sometimes it's just that it genuinely never comes up. Other times Sometimes there might be an in-universe reason why the word prosthetic or disabled is avoided, or prosthetic might just sound a bit too formal for the character in question. Hell, as a kid, I even used to call my own prosthetics my fake legs or my plastic legs if I really had to differentiate, because no 2-year-old is going to be able to say the word prosthetic correctly. However, in a lot of cases, I have noticed that this can also come from a place of discomfort with both limb difference and disability in general. In these cases, these alternative terms are used intentionally to separate characters from quote-unquote actual disabled people, and this happens in and out of media. In fact, that's actually why I use the word cyborg in my name. It did start as a joke, but I noticed over time that it caught the attention of people who think disability and amputee are bad words. And in a lot of cases, my content was the first time that they had been told that these words were actually fine. It does sound silly, but I had several people message me on TikTok when I was making disability content there that this had worked for them, so I stuck with it. It also gets the attention of people who just never made the connection between amputees and things like cyborgs as well. But yeah, back to how this affects your own work. If you're finding yourself avoiding using the real-world terms, ask yourself why. Sometimes this discomfort is not always a conscious decision, and it doesn't make you a bad person if you just haven't confronted those biases yet. But it is especially important if you're writing a character that those words refer to. Because if you're not even comfortable using the words that are literally meant to describe us, you are much more likely to end up writing a character whose disability is going to be minimized in some way, like the perfect prosthetic trope tends to do. If the reason that you don't use the real world terms is that you have your own in-universe terms, ask yourself why that's needed. I'm all for making up fun, setting specific names, but when you're talking about a group of marginalized people and their actual medical devices, consider what giving them an alternative name is actually adding, or at least how or why it came about. If the reason is something like this society is ableist and wanted to separate themselves from something that is generally considered undesirable like disability, for example, then actually tell us that in the story and do something with it. If it's not actually adding anything to your story, then just use the real words. And the final red flag is if the prosthetics are significantly more advanced than the rest of that society's technology. This was actually an addition I made after this video was nearly done, because I realized while I was looking for example footage that this was a reoccurring thing. But a lot of otherwise very modern and grounded stories have weirdly advanced prosthetics compared to the rest of the technology in the setting. Hell, this was even happening in stories with a historic or ancient setting. I've legitimately seen fantasy stories with a medieval European setting and little to no magic at all, with prosthetics that are better than what we have in the real modern world. And that would be fine if it was acknowledged and we were given some kind of in-universe reason for why this has happened. But in a lot of these stories, it's never explained. Honestly, I think this happens so often because people are genuinely unaware of how complex and technical prosthetics actually are, but it is a pretty consistent red flag that I've noticed. Every story where the prosthetic technology is substantially above everything else we see in the setting almost always has a perfect prosthetic. So that's just something to keep an eye out for in your own work. So now that we've talked about how to avoid this trope, let's focus for a moment on some common things that I've seen that you shouldn't do to move away from the perfect prosthetic trope. Number one is the enhanced prosthetic. A lot of sci-fi in particular will take prosthetic limbs, make them functionally exactly the same as a biological limb, then add something extra on top. It does change the way the prosthetic functions, but it still ignores the actual disabling parts of having a prosthetic. You can see this in pretty much any sci-fi story with a futuristic or high-tech setting, but I'm gonna use Fizzarali from Hell of a Boss to demonstrate what I mean. Fizz is a quadrilateral amputee with above knee and above elbow amputations, and highly advanced prosthetics that function more or less exactly like the limbs he lost, but with the added benefit of being super stretchy. And that does make sense. Fizz is an acrobat and a clown, and his prosthetics help him perform. And while we do see him using his prosthetics in fun ways, they don't actually change anything about his life outside of his act and some fun gags. They're treated almost the same way as Elastigirl's powers from The Incredibles, like a part of his actual body that just happens to be super stretchy, rather than prosthetics that are supposed to help him with his disability. He never takes them off, even when he's sleeping, and when he needs to use them as regular arms and legs, they do everything he needs perfectly fine, at least when they're working as intended. The word amputee or disabled is never used to describe him as far as I remember, and the fact that he is disabled never comes up at all. except for when his prosthetics break down, or when the story wants to focus on the tragic circumstances of how he lost them. This isn't to say that you can't do fun things with prosthetics. I love Fizz as a character and the fun things they do with his arms and legs. I want more characters with fun prosthetics, but you can do that while still treating them like prosthetics. For Fizz, the main thing would simply be to not have them glued to him all the time. Let him take them off when he's relaxing. Give him another set for day-to-day stuff, because the stretchy arms and legs are specialized, they're not built for daily use. Make that fun feature come with some kind of drawback, even when they're working perfectly fine. It doesn't have to be something big, just something. Which actually brings me to the next thing that you should avoid. The glitchy or broken prosthetic. Another way I see people trying to avoid the perfect prosthetic trope is to take a character's prosthetic and break it or make it otherwise unreliable by having it malfunction occasionally, or sometimes frequently, but not really changing anything outside of that. This can also include the prosthetic user only experiencing issues or downsides with their prosthetic when they're in a certain environment or when something is otherwise going wrong, but outside of those circumstances, the prosthetic is still a perfect replacement. This approach is heading in the right direction, but it still kind of misses the point of a lot of the criticism that limb different folks have with the depiction of prosthetics in the media. Yeah, prosthetics do break down sometimes, and they do require extra maintenance, but if your character's prosthetic is still exactly the same as a biological limb, or even better in the case of an enhanced prosthetic, and the only time their disability is treated like a disability is when it breaks, you're not really addressing the issue, because you're still treating the prosthetic in this case like a cure. Real prosthetics, like we've already discussed, even when functioning at 100% exactly as the manufacturer intended, don't function the same as a meat limb. They are fundamentally different, and the glitchy and unreliable prosthetic ignores all of that. Once again, Fizz is a really good example of this, since the only time we see his prosthetics as not being perfect is when they've broken down or are malfunctioning. Another example of this, as much as I hate to say it, can also be seen in both anime adaptations of Fullmetal Alchemist. But Sai, I hear you ask, didn't you just use Fullmetal as an example of how to avoid this trope? I did, but just because it does some things really well doesn't mean it's not guilty of making mistakes. It does use some of the suggestions I mentioned before, such as changing how Ed fights and showing us the maintenance that comes with having automail. But a lot of the changes are either mostly positive, such as making his automail arm and leg physically tougher than his biological ones, are only relevant when something is going wrong, or when Ed is in an environment the prosthetic isn't designed to handle. Outside of that though, the automail functions more or less exactly the same as his meat limbs. Don't get me wrong, Brotherhood in particular is headed in the right direction, and those things that I mentioned earlier are good things to include. Like I mentioned before, it's the only piece of media I've ever seen that acknowledges the added maintenance of being a child with prosthetics. And the fact that Ed needs different devices in different environments is great. But they're still not really addressing the core issue with this trope. The negatives of having automail shouldn't just be situational. There should be something about them that is consistently imperfect. Even when a prosthetic is in ideal circumstances, it's freshly installed, meaning that Ed hasn't grown out of it and has kept it up to date with the maintenance, and it's functioning at 100%, it should still work differently to his meat limbs, both in positive and negative ways. But for Ed, we only ever see the problems with having automail when the automail isn't functioning as intended. It is important to note that the manga's creator did do her research and she did consult with prosthetic users, but that was nearly 20 years ago, and a lot can change in 20 years, especially when we're talking about media. At that point in time, the perfect prosthetic trope wasn't really as prevalent as it is now. Nor was it really seen as an issue because the general public's consensus was still that amputation in particular was a fate worse than death, so this was still seen as a drastic improvement by most folks with a limb difference, regardless of its flaws. But times have changed, and I wanted to bring up Fullmetal in particular, because every time I talk about this trope, people without limb differences always bring it up as a perfect example of how to avoid it, specifically because Ed's automail breaks and it can't handle the cold, but that cannot be the only thing you do to avoid this trope in a story today. Again, that was good 20 years ago, but you really do need to have something about your character's prosthetic that is different, even when everything is working fine and you're in an ideal environment. Now, this isn't to say that you can never have your character's prosthetics break down or malfunction at all, just that this shouldn't be the only way that you're differentiating a prosthetic from a biological limb. Another common pitfall I see when people are trying to avoid the perfect prosthetic trope is to just give the character in question phantom pain, which is a side effect of amputation situation where your brain's mental map of the body doesn't acknowledge that you lost a limb. Your brain tries to fill in the gaps since there's no signal coming from that part of the body anymore, and assumes that something must be wrong and you should be in pain, even when you actually aren't. Alternatively, it can also happen when your brain was so used to feeling pain from that part of your body before that it just keeps remaking those old pain signals even once that body part is gone. Like the broken and glitchy prosthetic approach, this doesn't really address the issues with the perfect prosthetic trope, because it has nothing to do with the prosthetic itself. Phantom pain and phantom sensation don't come from the prosthetic, and so including it doesn't really address the issue of the prosthetic being a perfect replacement. This isn't to say that you shouldn't include phantom limb pain or sensation, but just keep in mind that when it's used on its own, it doesn't counter this trope. Also, be sure to do your research. Everyone's experience with phantom pain is different, and it's not even something that everyone with a limb difference actually experiences. But why is this trope even a problem in the first place? Why should you try to avoid it? Outside of just wanting to portray a real disability that affects real people more accurately in your work, the prevalence of this trope actually contributes to a lot of real-world issues, especially when it's as overused as it currently is. A little while ago, I did a written article about the Jaws effect, which I eventually do want to turn into a video, but I haven't got around to doing it yet, so for now, I'll just leave a link to that in the description. But to summarize, the Jaws effect is where the depiction of something in the media, especially something that the public is widely uneducated on, influences how people see it in real life. The Jaws effect specifically referred to how the popularity of creature feature movies featuring sharks like Jaws caused the belief that sharks were monstrous killing machines to become much more widespread, even going so far as to influence decisions about laws and policies surrounding real-life shark preservation and culling in some parts of the world. But sharks aren't the only thing this happens to. Disabled people are so thoroughly misunderstood by wider society that when tropes like this one become popular, people can often start to believe the misinformation that they spread. In this case, believing that our prosthetics are a perfect replacement for a biological limb, and that getting a prosthetic means that you're not disabled anymore. While this can be annoying and cause small-scale issues for some of us, like people giving us a hard time for using disability accommodations that we very much need, it can also impact us in systematic ways as well. If the wrong people believe these tropes, it can and does have a very real impact on the lives of disabled people through things like making changes to policies that make it harder for amputees and people with limb differences to access financial assistance for things outside of our prosthetics that we may need assistance with. Despite the very real harm that the perfect prosthetic trope can do when it's overused, I actually do think it has its place, and I don't think it should go away entirely. Some of my favourite pieces of media use the perfect prosthetic trope, and I think there are some kinds of media where it's pretty much unavoidable. Characters with perfect prosthetics in kids media in particular, especially when we're talking about side characters and minor characters, can help to correct some of the other stereotypes that kids may have seen elsewhere, such as prosthetics being creepy or scary, in a way that is casual and easy for them to understand. The problem with this trope, in my eyes, is more with its excessive overuse. It's the fact that it seems to have become the default, and the only representation that amputees and people with limb differences are getting at the moment. Not every story with a limb-different character can or even should delve into the reality of what using prosthetics is actually like, but right now we need more stories that do, especially without it becoming this majorly depressive thing. Hey, thanks for sticking around. Like I said, I want to get back into making videos more often, but at the moment I'm still experimenting and seeing which formats work best for me, so there might be some changes to the channel in the near future as well. This video was based on a post that I made for my website, so if you'd like to see the written version, I'll also link that below. And if you're interested in the artwork from the background of this video, I'll have links for that as well. Anyway, thanks again for sticking around, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!